Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're so excited to be able to share this evening with you. I hope that you can see on the screen the little word jumble from all of the things that everyone entered that they most value about UVA. It looks like community experience, honor, lawn, people. And so I see a definite trend of just the incredible community that UVA is able to offer. I would once again just like to welcome you to UVA Clubs and Office of Global Affairs virtual fireside chat for our alumni, parents, and friends in Asia. I'm Maggie Chopade. I'm the Senior Associate Director for the UVA Clubs Program of Global Engagement in the Office of Engagement and Advancement. Before we get started, I have just a couple housekeeping items for you. First, the program will be recorded and will be available after this event. And so just keep in mind that by joining us, that you give University of Virginia the right to use your voice or likeness or any depiction of these events, including sharing on social media. I think I mentioned earlier that we would love to know who's here tonight. So please feel free to write your name, your class, and where you're joining us tonight. It gives the panelists a really great opportunity to know who's here. We'll also be having a live Q&A session, and we have two ways for you to be able to participate in that. One way will be in order to raise your hand, you can ask a question live and interact with the panelists. You can also use the Q&A chat below, which I will be reading out those questions. So I don't take any more of the time for you to be able to hear the incredible panelists we have. I would like to introduce you to Steve Mull, who is our Vice Provost for Global Affairs at the University of Virginia. Through this role, he's the primary lead on global relations at the university and is responsible for developing strategic vision, designing outreach, and overseeing international activities. Steve's also responsible for overseeing institutional development of global partnerships and developing a wide array of services, programs, experiences, and strategic partnerships that promote global imagination within the university community. Steve joined university in August of 2018 after a 36-year career in the US Foreign Service, which included serving as acting Undersecretary for Political Affairs, implementation of the Iran nuclear deal, and service as the ambassador to Poland. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Steve Mull, who will also introduce you to our fellow panelists.
Maggie, thanks very much for that kind introduction, and good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Thanks so much for joining us today for this fireside chat focused on Southeast Asia and East Asia. Those of you in the UVA family who have a close association with the region know something that I learned very well in my diplomatic career. I served in Indonesia as Deputy Chief of Mission for a few years, and back in Washington, often spent a lot of time on national security issues related to East Asia and Southeast Asia. All of you know very well how important and how promising this region of the world is, and what enormous potential it has, resting on a really incredible entrepreneurial spirit, hardworking people who really value education for their families and for their children. It's of course a region with abundant natural resources, a real focus on trade and promoting investment, both from foreign partners in the United States as well as within the region. Compared to the rest of the world, it's a region that has a lot of political stability and extraordinary economic growth over the past 20 years. So it's really one of the most exciting regions of the world. And we're so looking forward, the panel and I, to hearing your perspective and questions about what's happening in the region. Of course, these days, there are certainly some trouble spots when we look at the region, mostly owing to the growing tensions that we've seen recently in the US-China relationship because of trade tensions, disputes over intellectual property, investment disputes, on national security issues such as freedom of navigation in the Western Pacific, the military presence in the Western Pacific, rising concerns about the status of Hong Kong, certainly in recent weeks, and generally human rights questions. While I think most of the countries of this region have managed this difficult task of maintaining good relations with both sides, I've often thought of the African proverb that says, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. So this kind of tension is in no one's interest. And I think communities like ours connected to UVA are uniquely positioned to help reduce those tensions and promote the kind of mutual understanding that I think is going to be really important to keep the nations of Southeast Asia and East Asia on an upward path with increasing political stability and economic growth. We're really blessed to have quite an experienced and I might even say wise panel with us today, who we'll turn to in a few minutes. But let me take a few minutes first to introduce them. We have Harry Harding, who is a university professor, the highest ranked professor that we can have here at UVA, and a senior fellow at the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. Professor Harding was also the founding dean of the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, one of our newest schools, and certainly one of our most exciting and most successful ones. Professor Harding has also served as the dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and he was also director of research and analysis at the Eurasia Group, one of the leading political risk advisory firms in the world. He's working on a new book that we're all very excited to read, entitled A Fraught Relationship, the United States and China, from Partners to Competitors since 1995. Joining Professor Hardy is someone very well known to him, if not all of us, his wife, Professor Shirley Lin. Professor Lin is the Compton Visiting Professor in World Politics, also at the Miller Center here at UVA. She's a member of the founding faculty of the Master's Program in Political Economy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And her book in 2016, it's a great read called Taiwan's China Dilemma, which was just published. It was published originally in the United States in 2016, but last year was published in Chinese. Professor Lin was previously a partner at Goldman Sachs, where she was in charge of the firm's investment in startups, well-known startups such as Alibaba and SMIC. She's on the board of Goldman Sachs Asia Bank and the Langham Hospitality Investments. And she is one of our most treasured analysts of events in economic and political developments in China, Taiwan, and the entire East Asia region. And then finally, last but certainly not least, we're really excited to have one of our most distinguished alumni in journalism, Michelle Jamrisco. Michelle graduated from the college in 2007 and is currently working as the Asia economy correspondent for Bloomberg News. And in this job, she tracks regional developments across trade, monetary policy, economic growth and development, and infrastructure and innovation. As I mentioned, she's based in Singapore, primarily focused on Southeast Asia, but she's also worked here or nearby here in Washington, D.C., covering the U.S. economy, the Congress, and government procurement issues. So I'm really pleased that all three of our distinguished panelists are able to join us today. Before we turn to them to get an update, hear about their views about what's happening in the region, I thought I'd brief a little bit on how we've been handling the COVID-19 pandemic crisis here at UVA. All of us who work here at UVA, no one can recall a semester like we've just finished with the kind of challenges that we've faced. since early March, when the university made a determination that it would probably not be safe to bring our students back from spring break, we moved very swiftly to put 3,000 classes completely online. I think in retrospect, it was pretty surprising how smooth it went, but I'm sure you can imagine what a challenge it was for professors, really just to have about 10 days notice to move the entire rest of their semester onto an online format. And I think they actually did a pretty remarkable job of it. And we didn't finish the semester as anyone anticipated we would, but nevertheless, we did finish it. We even had virtual final exercises that were really remarkable. If you haven't seen them yet, please go to the university's webpage and watch them, featuring special performances by Yo-Yo Ma and Dave Matthews, and really a sensational program of talent featuring our most recent graduates from UVA. One of the big challenges for the university as a result of this pandemic has been the impact on our global programs. UVA over the past few years has developed an extraordinary overseas presence. We have, of course, the office there in Shanghai that's done a remarkable job. We've also risen to one of the top 20 universities in the United States with the number of students who study abroad at some point during their college career. We, unfortunately, as a result of the pandemic, had to bring all of our students home right in the middle of the semester. We had just over 400 students, including in Asia, but also in South Asia, in Africa, and Europe, and Latin America. And we had to bring them all home with just a few days notice. And fortunately, we were able to succeed in doing that. So looking forward to the fall, we're still feeling our way for what this will look like. Last week, President Ryan sent out a communication to the UVA community indicating that we will start the fall semester on time on August 25th, and we will be having classes, in-person classes, here at the university. However, there are a number of things that we're still looking to clarify. While we're looking forward to welcoming at least some students back to grounds, we don't know yet if we're going to be able to accommodate all of them. And for those who are here, we're not sure what the classroom experience is going to look like yet. At this point, we're working very closely with epidemiologists, experts in the health system, working very closely with the Virginia State Departments of Health and Education. And as we go through the summer, we will begin to get a clearer idea of the kinds of conditions that will be prevailing here on grounds. Certainly testing is going to be an important part of it to make sure that students or staff or faculty who are concerned that they may be infected or exposed will have the opportunity for them to be rapidly tested and, if necessary, isolated to protect the rest of the community. The challenge of holding classrooms while maintaining social distancing provisions is going to be a bit of a challenge. One of our biggest lecture halls, Now Hall, which can usually accommodate about 500 students. If we have 6 feet between each student, we can only probably fit a few dozen students into there. So we're in the midst of exploring other options for classroom space, including places like John Paul Jones Arena, Memorial Gymnasium, and other large spaces around town where our students will be able to fit and learn without getting too close to their classmates. But one thing is for certain is that it's very clear we're going to have some online instruction Certainly larger classes that would normally have 200 to 300 students, those classes will probably be online, while the smaller classes, we will do the best that we can to accommodate them. We're also going to look at how we structure the whole academic year to give different opportunities at different points in the year for our students to get their full education. So for example, J-term, the break between the semesters in January, that's been a very popular time of year to take short courses or to do short international programs. We're going to substantially expand the offerings of credit courses in the J-term next year, so that those students who aren't able to come to grounds in the fall will be able to make up some of their fall work in the J-term. We're also going to expand offerings in the summer, next summer, so that it would be possible, for example, for a student to come to UVA starting in January with a good selection of courses in J-term, then have a full spring semester, and then in the summer complete what they would have done in the fall and complement what they do during the J-term, so that by the middle of the summer, even if you're only starting in January, you will have been able to have a full academic year. So the key guiding principle for us is going to just be able to present a lot of options for our students to accomplish their full credit load in various different configurations through the year, so that by the time we get to next summer, everyone will have a full academic year behind them. We will have a special challenge for residence halls. We're not sure that we're going to be able to put 2 students per dormitory room as we normally would do. So our student affairs staff is working very closely with the health system to develop scenarios for how we house our students in residence halls while doing so safely and protecting them. And certainly we're increasing janitorial services, sanitation services. There are going to be hand sanitizing stations all over grounds that weren't there before. So that's a work that's still in progress. We are particularly sympathetic to the challenges that our international students face. As all of you know, the borders are closed for travelers who've spent the previous 2 weeks in China, in Brazil, in Europe, and Iran. Together, those 4 regions comprise a pretty large majority of our international student community. And so we are eagerly awaiting news for when the borders will reopen for travelers from those countries. Additionally, there's another challenge that U.S. embassies and consulates are not issuing. They're not open for routine visa applications. So any of our students who need visas, unfortunately, are not able to get them as of now. My previous colleagues in the State Department have assured me that an important goal of this summer at every U.S. embassy and consulate around the world is to resume that visa processing. So we're hopeful that as we get into the middle of summer, it will be increasingly possible for our students who need visas to apply for them. If the worst case happens, if the borders remain closed, if people still aren't able to get visas, we still very much will guarantee online instruction availability for all of our new students and all of our returning students as well. They'll be able to get access to their classes, and they will have access to online instruction for as long as they need it, until whenever they are able to join us here on grounds. So this isn't the kind of semester that our new students, or certainly our faculty, had in mind, I'm sure, for their UVA experience. But we're absolutely committed to making it a successful experience, to be the same high quality UVA education that all of you are familiar with. And we are setting up special networks of contacts with all of our international students through the summer to hear about their concerns or challenges that they are having. And we have formed a team here at the university to address those specific challenges of our international students to make sure that they have the easiest possible relationship with us as we get through this particularly challenging period. So I really invite all of you, either in our discussion later this morning, or to please contact me by email at any time if you have concerns or questions, or there are problems you'd like to alert us to at the university. We're absolutely committed to solving those problems and supporting our community, no matter what the challenges are that we face. So with that as an introduction, I'd now like to turn to our panelists to hear their perspective of what the situation is like in Southeast Asia and East Asia, and to hear from, enjoy their expertise. So I think, Harry, why don't we start with you, if I could turn the floor over to you. Welcome again, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Steve, very much. Delighted to be here together with Shirley. I'm going to let Shirley talk more about Hong Kong. She is a Hong Konger, though both of us spend time there. I'll just say a few things about Taiwan. We came out here because of a very serious illness in our extended family. We came out as we were beginning to finish classes from the beginning of the spring term, and we came out here as spring break got underway. But as we were, beginning to think about going back, our responsibilities here having been more or less completed, of course, by that time the university had shut down. And we were then realized that this was a safer, actually, place to be than many other places in the world that we might have been. I want to say a few words about why that is. Many people give a cultural explanation and say that perhaps Asian societies have more of a collectivist mentality, are willing to make common sacrifices for the common good. This is not to say that Taiwanese people were unthinkingly compliant with government instructions. The press conferences that were held regularly by the so-called command center were subject to a lot of very poignant questions from those in attendance. But basically, Taiwanese people trust their government, and the particular people in charge of the command center were very, very capable and were able to even build on that trust. Secondly, Taiwan, as we've come to learn, has a really good public health system. I won't go into the details, but let's just say it is very easy to access, it is extremely inexpensive, it's easy to get appointments, and that's another reason why we feel safe here. And third, and perhaps most importantly, maybe two more things. One was that Taiwan was prepared. Here in Taiwan, we've gone through previous pandemics, SARS, which some people may remember, swine flu, and other pandemics. And so we've had experience that many other countries, I think including the United States, have lacked. So Taiwan was ready and was able to launch the command center and start giving bulletins, undertaking public health preventive measures from a very early stage. We also have to thank our parallel government, shall we say, across the strait, who in their disappointment with some aspects of our government here on Taiwan, especially our president Tsai Ing-wen, had closed down opportunities for both individual and group tours to come to Taiwan. And so basically we did shut our borders, but already the flow of people, many of whom would probably have been carrying disease, had already been dramatically reduced. So we feel very safe. Things are remarkably normal now. You have to wear a mask on public transportation. Many people just wear it on the street. You go into a building, you're expected to use hand sanitizer, Steve, as you were talking about for UVA. But other than that, restaurants are open, bars are open. I'm not sure about movie theaters. There are a few things that have close proximity, social distancing problems. But I'll turn it over to Shirley to talk about a somewhat different situation in Hong Kong.
Hi, everybody. I am not only a faculty member in the politics department and a fellow at the Miller Center, but I'm also a parent with a fourth year who just graduated virtually 2 weeks ago. And I understand when Steve said that it was incredible. We moved everything online as I've been coming out to Taipei twice, first to observe the 2020 presidential election in January, went back to grounds, and then came back here immediately for a family emergency, but then of course did not go back to Virginia since, and we were able to move classes and advising students online quite smoothly. And I am pleased to say that online graduation didn't seem to be as awful as I had expected. Yes, the big concern is what will young people be doing in 2020 and 2021 all around the world. And I'm particularly concerned not only as a parent, but also because I have been teaching fourth-year students in Beijing, Hong Kong, Virginia, and Taiwan for the last 10 years, spread out quite evenly, but most committed, of course, to Charlottesville and being on grounds every fall. But my particular expertise is I'm a political economist. And so what's also very worrying to me is how will the economies do? Where I spend a third of my time, Hong Kong will see for the first time -7% growth. China, as everyone knows, is the driver of much of Southeast Asia's growth. Hong Kong is going to be -10%, and China is going to be close to -7%. And this is something that we all have to adjust to, particularly as the global value chain changes, and there will be new winners and losers. On top of that, we have a political upheaval, of course. And what I study is the relationship between national identity and economic policy. So in that, I focus on Beijing, Hong Kong, Taipei, Washington relations. And on that note, I'm not going to go into it because there's so much to say. And I realize that many of your questions actually touch on that, but only to say that Hong Kong is now under extraordinary pressure as the US, as Steve just said, when the two elephants fight. What will happen to Hong Kongers? As somebody who's lived in Hong Kong nearly 30 years, I think whether as a result of the Chinese imposition of this new national security law, or the reaction on Washington's side, which is to preserve human rights and help Hong Kongers, but in effect, some of the sanctions and other policies might impact Hong Kong individuals and private sector more than change Beijing's way of doing things. So that's something that I am looking closely at and have been doing a lot of writing and thinking about. I would say the final thing is all of this, of course, impacts where we are, and to move away from the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic is very important. Taiwan now is in its 50th day with no new case and only 7 deaths. And every single death in Taiwan was monumental, meaning everyone says, wow, number 7. And people are very concerned and they, I think, focus on helping each other, helping the government helping the citizens to get over this challenge. And Hong Kong similarly has had over 1,000 cases. Of course, it is on the border of China, and Hong Kong is an island. Taiwan is an island, and therefore a little bit better able to socially isolate from travelers. But on top of all of this, what I just talked about in terms of political upheaval in Hong Kong also has important implications for Taiwan, as Taiwan watches carefully what is going to happen to Hong Kong in the next few months. And just to conclude, I think that US-China relations is at a time like no other. And this is keeping us very, very busy, whether we are there or here or anywhere. And this is one of the pleasure and destructive forces of an online society, in that we're all very connected and very busy. But I hope to interact on this call with everybody.
Thanks so much, Shirley and Harry. Now let's go to Singapore. Michelle, great to have you on with us.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining. Hope this finds you in good spirits and good health in trying times. Yes, I'm here in Singapore. I've been here for about 3 years now. Came over from the Washington, D.C. Bureau for Bloomberg and to cover the very dynamic Southeast Asia economy. And who would have thought we would have been through two major crises already in just my 3 years here, but we're trying to make the best of it in many ways. I think Singapore here, I often think of my perspective, both professionally and personally, being in this sort of node as global, regional, and local. And I think Singapore is just a fascinating spot to kind of get those three perspectives, especially when you're living in a time like this with a pandemic that's affecting all three very differently. So, I've thought about that a little bit in terms of, both the trends that Harry and Shirley have mentioned, how those affect Southeast Asia, and many parts I can see in the chat where people are located this evening, just very different effects that those macro impacts can have. And if you can't tell from my use of the word macro, I'm also in the same field as Shirley in terms of looking at the economic impact and mainly focused on the economies of this region, which remain very dynamic despite the challenges ahead. So, that's one thing that we're often focused on is not just the major global implications of some of these crises, but also how each individual economy is tackling those and what unique challenges and benefits that they're seeing to their specific constituencies. So for example, here in Singapore, I can say, starting from the situation right now, it's very much, we strive, I think, to be as in good health as Taiwan in terms of both policy governance and as well as the health perspective. Singapore did, if people may have been following this at the start of the pandemic, Singapore was conducting, testing and doing things a bit with a lighter touch. Didn't have as much of an outbreak here. But since then, there is a unique challenge, very domestic challenge with the migrant worker dorms in Singapore, where we have upwards of 35,000 cases now confirmed, 90% of which are from these migrant worker dorms, which tend to be more tightly packed than policymakers or even the businesses will admit they wanted them to be. So that's become a separate political situation. And oh, by the way, an election is coming very soon. So this is all kind of happening at once. But even with that, I would also highlight some of the factors that Harry and Shirley have mentioned that have benefited Taiwan in their response to this crisis, which is certainly a high level of government trust here. And that's born of a sort of decades-long competency from the government. I often joke to friends back home that things work here, and some of my friends who are living in cities in the U.S. and unfortunately now it's not so much a joke, but there are not as much there's not as much policy response, swift policy response, and competent policy response that you have come to know here in Singapore as I've been living here. And finally, the health response. Despite the numbers, and sometimes those can be misleading, we do certainly have a strong health system here in Singapore. And I think the main goal of the policymakers is to make sure that all are tested, specifically again in the migrant worker dorms that I mentioned. They're certainly subscribers to a mass testing theory. They're doing very well in terms of contact tracing. There's certain apps and things that we could get into later about how they're really going digital in terms of the health response. So those are things that kind of, boost the confidence of residents here. But in terms of what's ahead, again, the economic policy challenges are massive. As Shirley mentioned, the growth across the region is just, the estimates are disastrous. Even for Singapore, which is used to churning out very solid growth numbers years at a time, the estimate now by the government is for perhaps the worst recession since independence in 1965, and maybe by far. Across the region, they're dealing with much of the same. Unfortunately, Vietnam seems to be the only one that some economists are fairly confident could eke out a year of growth this year. And there's certain reasons for that in terms of their dynamism. But across the board, really, really hefty challenges. And policymakers are just trying to remain nimble to their response in this region and try to figure things out as they go while making sure that their constituencies are safe. So a lot to unpack, and we can take that in any direction. But it is still a very dynamic region and a great region to be in right now to witness all this.
Well, thanks very much, Michelle. And I'd like to pick up on your comments. One of the strange things of watching the economic impact of the pandemic here in the United States has been this growing divergence. I mean, we're obviously entering into a period of massive unemployment, not seen since the Great Depression in the 1930s, and in fact, it might even exceed unemployment levels from the Depression by the time we get finished with all of this. And we have that on one side, and then looking at the stock market on the other side, which after a pretty significant drop in February and March is just booming and going ahead. And with the eruption of so much social and political unrest in the United States over the past week, I thought, oh, this is going to, once again send the stock market crashing. And so far, I mean, it hasn't really happened. This obviously has implications for the university because we're very much hoping to rely on our endowment, much of which is invested into the stock market, to get through our own financial crisis here at the university that we're going to be experiencing for at least the next year. The hospital system alone has lost more than $100 million since the end of February. And the academic side of the university, we've also faced a massive crunch. And so we follow the stock market very, very closely with the impact it has on our endowment. So Shirley, I wonder if we could ask you as a former investment banker, where do you think all of this is going? How does it look there in Asia, despite the gloomy prospects for growth? Is there longer term optimism? Are the economic foundations sound? Do you expect that growth will return after a year or two?
I think that's a hard question to answer in brief, but let me tackle the first part, which is what is the outlook? The outlook, I think, is grim, Steve. And despite the stock market and to not get into the political side of it, it's a very important year for the United States. Elections are coming up, and I think that we all hope the stock market is stable, but at the same time, the fundamental is not sound in terms of the global economy. But I want to focus a bit on Southeast Asia and Asia for this call, and as a supplier to much of the world's demand. Global demand is softening. There's no doubt about it. And first quarter, for example, in Taiwan, there was record export, but everyone knows that was temporary. And because as the global demand catches up in terms of decline, I think all of Asia will be impacted. But the time it takes for this to all filter out, as actually people start to look at more cost-effective ways to divert trade, is coupled with the trade war between the United States and China. And most importantly, for what I am focused on, is the decoupling of technology. With new export control by the United States, there will be many, many suppliers in Asia that have to choose between supplying to Chinese customers and to high-tech American customers. All of this means is that there is major readjustment. And I think we're going to enter a period that is more challenging than the global financial crisis. But the time it takes for each economy to filter it out will be different. And there is another issue, which is every single country is now going to rely on quantitative easing to help. And fiscal stimulus means that we are going to be looking at competitive quantitative easing, which also makes it very hard to make investments. And therefore, I wouldn't count on the endowment consistently doing well, as we have had more difficulty to find places to invest. And that is also why I think the stock market, on a temporary basis, there is a lot of liquidity.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for that. Michelle, you know, one thing that you and I have in common, we're both refugees from Washington, D.C. and I don't know about you, but even though I'm so happy to be here in Charlottesville since I arrived here in 2018, I can't always let go of what's going on in Washington, and each day seems to bring new dramas and uncertainty. I'm sure it's the same for you sitting there in Singapore. So Shirley mentioned, of course, we're entering into a pretty intense election cycle here in the US. I wonder what your perspective is there from Singapore. Do you think that the campaign will have much of an impact or will attract much interest there in Southeast Asia? And do you think either President Trump's re-election or Joe Biden's successful election, will the outcome of that election have much of an impact on Southeast Asia?
Well, I think certainly there's interest here. You know, day to day, you know, some of the Trump headlines or U.S. headlines in general still carry a lot of weight in Southeast Asia and in Singapore, especially among the business community. You know, it's hard to say whether, you know, they're going to be following day to day at the closeness that DC is. I don't think that's the case. I think, you know, in my former job when I was based in DC, of course, it can be all consuming, even if you're on the economy beat. It certainly was, and especially in this past election, it certainly was sort of all consuming in the sense of trying to explain some of the different economic debates that were being had on the campaign trail and whether there was fact checking to be done on either side, and you know, how to kind of put that out very objectively in an economic reporting standpoint. So I think, you know, from that perspective, I think it's a little bit lighter load here right now, being still several months away from the election, which is fast approaching, but it's still not right on our doorstep in Southeast Asia. But in terms of the response and the outcome having an impact, certainly, I think just in the topics that we've already mentioned, US, China, and Hong Kong being two of the foremost ones, which Harry and Shirley could speak more on, there certainly are, you know, having a big ripple effect across the region, certainly here in Singapore. And I think often from the perspective of the economies in this region in Southeast Asia, these 10 economies thinking about, well, will we have to choose between US and China? And that has been the, you know, the overwhelming question amid the trade war is, you know, how can we be friends with both? How can we maintain both as a customer base? Of course, China is the biggest customer for most all of those economies, but the US is a big presence, of course, in business and in you know, military ties and alliances. So it's, they never want to be tortured with that decision. I think Singapore officials here have not been shy about stating that repeatedly, even when they're normally diplomatic and quiet about getting involved in US politics. They have actually come out. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has said several times, we don't want to be forced to choose. You know, we want to work with both sides. We don't want to have to pick sides, and you know, damn be the day if we have to do so. So I think in that respect, yes, that's been something they've been dealing with for quite a while. I think not much has changed in terms of you know, whether businesses and residents here are confident in who might win the U.S. election. And I think when we're asked as you know, Americans abroad, you know, I think they understand when we say we don't know either. So I think there's just you know, kind of an overwhelming uncertainty around that, not just on the U.S. side, but also here. But that doesn't mean it's a waning interest. I think there's a lot of issues to be had, and again, Hong Kong and U.S. China at the forefront.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Michelle. Harry, I wonder if we could hear your perspective on the more hard security issues, for a lack of a better term. For most of the past 20 years, there have been occasional military brush-ups. Remember in the early part of this century, the U.S. Navy plane, P-3 plane that was forced down on Hainan Island. And over the past 20 years, occasionally we've had brush-ups between the U.S. military presence and the Chinese military presence in the waters of Southeast Asia. But for the most part, tensions have been confined to the economic, trade, and investment sphere. Certainly, during the trade war that Michelle mentioned at the beginning of the Trump administration. And although there was hope that there would be a trade deal, there are now indications that the trade deal may be off until some of these other issues are resolved. What do you think, as these economic and trade tensions intensify, what are the risks of a spillover into more sort of military tensions between the US and China there in the region?
Well, I think that they are pretty high in certain areas of the military relationship. I think that the two countries are in an arms race, and that arms race could well intensify. Basically, the Chinese are basically interested in what is called anti-access and area denial. That is, making it extremely costly for the Americans, especially the American Navy, to enter the Western Pacific, to deal with certain contingencies, especially hypothetically a Chinese attack on Taiwan. And in the same way, then the United States wants to try to counter that and preserve our access. So that's in a way the most worrying part. Shirley has already mentioned the fact that Taiwan is looking at Hong Kong. The Chinese, Xi Jinping in particular, have said that the one country, two systems formula, which China is busy in a way redefining as we speak, will be the same formula that they wish to unify with Taiwan under. Taiwanese now, it's very clear, just have no interest in that at all. And it's for the understandable reasons. It's totally unacceptable. So I think that the Chinese are sort of upping the ante with regard to demonstrations of their ability to attack Taiwan, perhaps someday more than others. There are worries here that what's called armed unification or armed unification by force is on the horizon, because Xi Jinping has said, in essence, he doesn't want this to go over, this issue of unification to be spilled over to the next paramount leader. So I think that whether it's the South China Sea, where again, the Chinese are trying to push the United States back from the coast of China to militarize some of the South China Sea islands, whether it has to do with Taiwan. Yes, there is the possibility of some kind of a military confrontation. I do take some comfort in the fact that we are both nuclear powers. And that just in the same way that the United States and the Soviet Union were able to avoid war because of that fact, I think that cooler heads will ultimately prevail in the case of the dust-up with regard to the United States and China. But that's not certain. So I do worry about it. So in short, what I worry about more is just a very costly arms race that does run risks also of various kinds of accidents. Then the question is, how good are the conflict or the crisis management mechanisms? So yes, this is a major part of the US-China relationship equation.
Thanks very much, Harry. I recall one of the things that, in fact, help prevent accidents from happening between the United States and the Soviet Union was, in fact, an agreement over how to handle accidental encounters of military forces. I remember when I was still in government, I devoted some attention to pursuing a similar arrangement with China for various reasons. It didn't succeed, but I agree with you. That's something constructive that either a new Trump administration or a Biden administration should probably put at the top of its agenda, even as these tensions persist, try to minimize the chances of those kind of accidental encounters. I want to make sure we hear from our community there in the region. So Maggie, how about I turn the floor back to you? We'd love to hear some of the thoughts and questions that our community have today.
Sure, and thank you all for your great introductions and conversation. So as we move into the live Q&A, I want to offer, there are two different ways that you can get involved. Some of you have already submitted a question in the Q&A. You can also raise your hand, and we would love to take your question live, and we can unmute you for that. So to get started, we have a William Thomas who would love to ask the panelists a question. William, I think you are now able to talk. If not, okay, well, I will ask another question while we figure out
I think William's come off mute.
Are you there now?
Yep, I think I'm here now.
Yay!
There we go. Great. Hi. Hi. Yeah, this is William in Singapore. And my question is about Western businesses with regional offices in Hong Kong. And I'm wondering, do we anticipate that a large number of those companies may move their offices out of Hong Kong and potentially, say, to Singapore? Or is it more likely that these firms will find a way to exist within, basically to accept Beijing's changes and try to navigate whatever changes the US may have in terms of its Hong Kong relationship?
Shirley, or
yeah, I'll jump in first. I'm sure Michelle and Harry have more to say, but as a long-term resident in the private sector in Hong Kong, what's happening right now, I doubt will have immediate impact, in the sense that last year the impact already started because of the anti-extradition protests and the fact that the extradition bill was being discussed in such a controversial fashion. Those who thought that Hong Kong was not a place for them started to move capital. But if you look at the numbers that were released, actually, for example, hedge funds and financial institutions, actually the move was not tremendous. And I think there are several reasons for it. And Singapore is the obvious beneficiary. Hold on, I'm just. Sorry, let me continue. The capital movement wasn't so great, and I doubt it will be dramatic this year, in the sense that the issue with what's going to happen is unclear yet. First of all, on the national security law, it's not clear, but I think if it will be threatening, it has already been since the booksellers were abducted a few years ago. Many people already felt that the risk exists, and I think Michelle can speak more to this in terms of freedom of speech. And I feel that in academic circles, people are already self-censoring. And so there's a large part of that already has happened and is not going to be changed, except, for example, the current national security law could restrict NGOs, so that NGOs in Hong Kong would be like NGOs in China, which have been very restrictive, increasingly so. On the business side, I think what's more probably problematic is in terms of US, what the US will do. But you have to remember, in terms of tariffs, Hong Kong actually has very limited export that would be affected. And it is very unclear too how the US will change bilaterally tariffs with Hong Kong, given that Hong Kong is a separate customs area under the WTO. So in short, I think the multinational companies that are operating in Hong Kong, I don't think will be leaving suddenly for Singapore, for the additional reason, and I lived in Singapore for a year when I was doing the Singapore telecom privatization. I think Singapore as a base for doing business in China is still 4.5 hours away, and it has its own limitations. And I've done that for several years, and I know that difficulty. But in terms of tax advantage, of course, Singapore is the beneficiary. But in terms of geographic location, people are trying to figure out what to do. But the immediate threat to most companies that are trading or in financial services, I think is not going to be as dramatic as you think. What is really dramatic, of course, is individual freedom. And for people to be doing sensitive activities. And I think on that note, I want to ask Michelle what you think of the impact for journalism, and also for Harry, what you think the impact may be.
No, I think that's right. I mean, from the Singapore perspective, a lot of what you've just said is what it matches what we hear from here and how Singapore has looked at the situation. I think, William, I appreciate the question because it's something that we've been following since the protests started in Hong Kong, but also even since the trade war started, just in terms of, you know, where it makes the most sense for businesses to be positioned, where they maybe draw down staff, or maybe they build staff in other places. And I think one thing that Shirley mentioned really hits home because in terms of serving as a gateway to China, Hong Kong has always been there for businesses from that aspect. And I think I would say remains so. If you want to be a business operating in China, Hong Kong is still a good place to be even right now. I think the question is if you're a business that decides no, you're not going to do business in China anymore, then maybe it's a question of where do you go. And Singapore, obviously, a great place in terms of regulatory environment, rule of law, and all those sorts of things that appeal to businesses. What we've been seeing from the data from this side in Singapore over the past year is the same, is a very modest movement. You know, I'm sure we're looking at a lot of the same data, but some of the more local gauges that people have been using as proxies to figure out if there have been movements here, aside from anecdotal evidence, have been things like education, school enrollments, property purchases by Chinese nationals or Hong Kong nationals. And those haven't really moved that much. There was a little bit of an uptick in those sorts of measures in the past year, but not as much as maybe some would have expected given what was happening there and sort of the destabilizing tone of all those conversations. I think from a journalism perspective and from freedom of speech perspective, surely you asked, I mean, I think it's something different and something that journalists worldwide have had to kind of grapple with these past few years, unfortunately, in different pockets. And so that's just something that we have to handle day to day. But as now, you know, we still have a very full bureau in Hong Kong that's actually getting back to work faster in this pandemic than here in Singapore. And so that hasn't really been an obstacle so far, thankfully.
Let me just add a few things, a few words about what I understand to be some of the major advantages of Hong Kong as a place for people to do business, and then to say whether we think those will be dampened or damaged by the tensions between the United States and China. One we've already touched upon, and that is the free flow of information. Obviously, for any financial center, information is absolutely critically important. And we're watching that very, very carefully now as China tries to exercise greater influence over the media. So far, I'd say, obviously, political news is more sensitive than commercial, financial news, but that's a hard line there, it's a boundary to draw. So we need to look at that. Number two is the fact that Hong Kong has not only the rule of law, but the rule of common law. Shirley can talk about that more, but she thinks that's really important to have that English style common law system. Interestingly, there have been some people in Hong Kong very much linked to the mainland just in the past day or so, who are assuring Hong Kong people not only that the rule of law will continue, foreign judges will continue, or they say should be able to continue to serve on the bench, and also whatever is done with the national security legislation should be in keeping with a common law system. That's very promising. Of course, we don't know what the national security legislation is actually going to say, or the broader trend shaping the legal environment. Finally, and lastly, a major advantage of Hong Kong is that it has an entirely convertible currency that's pegged to the US dollar. That is what some are calling the nuclear option if the United States decided to cut Hong Kong off from the American banking system. Everybody's waiting to see whether Trump will touch that. The Hong Kong government is saying that it will maintain the peg, at least under present conditions. It looks like it has enough dollar reserves to be able to do it. But still, that is one of the areas of potential vulnerability that depends on what the United States government decides to do.
Great, thanks everyone. We have another question from Corinne Loy. Corinne, I am going to unmute you so that you can ask your question now.
Hi, Corinne here. Thanks everyone. I just had a question as to whether, with reference to this increasing quote unquote Cold War between the US and China, what you've seen in terms of the impact on earlier stage innovation, because I speak from the perspective of a medical device entrepreneur in Singapore. And I've been hearing murmurs that, you know, we need to be careful about taking money from Chinese-based investors, China-based investors, because that might have a longer-term negative impact on our ability to exit later. So I was curious as to what the basis for that, so those type of cautionary notes, what the basis is. Because from my perspective, it seems to me that if you take on a minority Chinese investor, how could that possibly, you know, have an impact on a later term exit? So if anyone has heard any comments about this, any views, please do share. Thank you.
I guess I'll have to jump in here. As somebody who had been in VC and now, of course, very focused on US-China relations and policy. There's two aspects to it. First of all, I like to do a little promotion. Harry and I organized and is on the Miller Center website a 4-hour actually symposium on May 4th, and it's called the Battle Symposium. In there, although there are very important keynote speeches by current administration official as well as Obama administration official, we like to encourage you to look at the last 2 hours where there was a panel. And the panel had four of our colleagues that talked about collaboration on the academic side, which actually to me is very important to startup innovation. And this is where it became a very, the topic of our symposium is can rivals cooperate? And this is quite important. The other three were talking about healthcare, data collection, and the fourth one was security. Evan talked about security. So what I'm trying to say is actually Ram, the Vice President for Research at University of Virginia, addressed this issue and said that there was no way we can move forward on innovation unless we continue to collaborate with scientists between the United States and China. However, at the same time, if you hear our 4 panelists, 2 were of the view that it is quite worrisome. When you look at data collection, the Chinese companies were collecting far more data in the United States than the other way around. And so the competition, of course, is not fair. But what that means in terms of policy, and this is when we come back to the first keynote speaker, Matt Pottinger, who, of course, has pushed through a lot of policy to restrict, if you will, Chinese scientists working in the United States, or more importantly, for even University of Virginia scientists and academics to take money from universities, Chinese universities. And this also extends to what you're probably more worried about, which is slightly more technical and long-term, which is if you have in Series A or B, Chinese capital that is deemed to be onshore or Chinese related venture capital money, can you actually go public in the United States? This is a question that I believe remains to be seen. I don't think you can conclude right now what the long-term impact will be. And as a matter of example, in Taiwan, for example, I know several startups that had taken money that had very small amounts of money from Chinese venture capitalists, which had to actually ask them to sell in the secondary market because Taiwan passed an anti-infiltration act December 31st last year that basically would sanction any company that has Chinese capital or investments. And this made it not so, it didn't look so good anymore for any company to have any kind of capital, whether small or large, coming from mainland China. And I think this is an issue as the US and China decouple. This will extend to more and more countries, although each country for different reason would be legislating in a way that would make it more confusing. So it's very hard to answer your question, but I hope I addressed the bigger sort of logic behind it and the trend, which I think will go on for several more years.
Would anybody else like to share an answer?
I'm not sure I have any expertise to add to what Shirley said, but I will just say that in asking the question, you made me think about another related trend that we're watching in terms of accepting investment, and that is on the foreign direct investment side. So not very specific to your question, but one economy I follow quite closely these days is Vietnam, and it's a situation in which they have been very candid about saying from the government level, we need to attract investment, yes, but we now need to be picky about what we're attracting, not just for political reasons, because they could be caught in the crossfire continuously between the US and China, but also for development purposes. On the sidelines of the trade war, they were also often deemed the winner in terms of getting some production that was coming out of China. But in finding that a lot of that was production from Chinese businesses that were maybe temporarily moving, production across the border or doing it in a way that didn't really benefit the Vietnamese economy, they've had to scrupulate that a little bit more and be a little bit more picky about what they accept in terms of FDI. So there are some dangers in terms of that, but unfortunately I can't really speak specifically to your good question on the VC side, on the business side.
If I could, we've talked about the US-China commercial rivalry as being a trade war. And of course, that's where it started with the tariffs that President Trump imposed on various imports from China, the Chinese counter tariffs, and that has not been completely resolved, as was already alluded to. But I think what's important for everyone to realize is this goes far beyond trade. And in some ways, I think that trade in finished goods is not even, or agricultural goods, is not even the most important part of it. It also has to do, as we've said, with investment. Basically, America being more restrictive about basically Chinese listings on American exchanges, incoming foreign direct investment from China, whether it's majority or even minority shareholding. Also, it's a technology competition. Who is going to develop and market the most advanced technologies? Who is going to get the patents? Who is going to set standards, the technical standards that other parts of the world will follow? So is trade, and also people are talking about a finance war. We already talked about the idea that the US could try to block the Chinese financial system's access to the US. The Chinese are clearly very nervous about the extent to which the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. They would love to weaken that and replace it with some kind of international currency. So these are the major kind of areas, the battlegrounds of this competition. It's not just trade in blue jeans and other light manufactured goods, which is where, of course, the tension started, but it's not where they're ending up.
Great, thank you so much. Shirley, I think we're about at our last time. As we close for the evening, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But does any of the panelists have anything final they'd like to say before we conclude?
Yeah, I wanted to maybe say something about Southeast Asia, which I had prepared to say, but no question was raised that was appropriate. So I'm just going to raise it myself. In the last, I would say year to two, because of what is happening in Washington, D.C., with the Indo-Pacific strategy, what has happened actually, because Harry and I, of course, divide our time between Asia and Virginia. So we see this quite clearly. As U.S.-China go into enter a more competitive and full-out rivalrous relationship, what has happened actually is many Asian countries in Southeast Asia have actually united more than ever, which in the past, actually, in some ways, Asia was very divided. And we had a firsthand experience, Harry and I, for our time off from University of Virginia in 2018, came to teach in Taiwan for one semester. And my students were 80% Southeast Asian students. It was a wonderful experience because we don't nearly have as many Southeast Asian students at University of Virginia in terms of percentage. And it was a huge percentage here. And for the first time, you really feel this sense of Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia coming together as a community. I know the #1 destination for Southeast Asian students actually is to, in terms of desire, priority, is to go to Japan, which really surprised me when I looked at data. But in looking at how the US is actually leading effort to work together, I have personally been working for the consulate here to, well, I should say more accurately for the for AIT in Taiwan to put together Women Empowerment Program, which gathers representatives from Southeast Asia, women leaders, to work together with Taiwanese to put together ways to help them, and especially in terms of governance and policy, to design effective policy in Southeast Asia in democratic countries. And of course, working with Philippines, Indonesia, I see many participants in Malaysia. This is a great initiative, which I've had the chance to meet more leaders in Southeast Asia. And also recently, another new effort by the American government, which at UVA we also have a chance to work closely with, is to promote talent circulation among Asian countries. And in that light, there's a lot of programs now, and we're hoping to help UVA become, and Steve is very involved with this, to get UVA to have more relationship with Southeast Asian and Asian universities, to have more internships, just as the pandemic cut the possibility off temporarily. But we know, we hope Steve will continue to do the great work that he's already started.
Harry, Michelle, is there anything you'd like to conclude?
Well, since Shirley gave a shout out to Southeast Asia, I'll just have to echo that, but also say, I think what's underappreciated with the rest of the world is that they sometimes ignore Southeast Asia to their detriment. And I think especially now there's a lot going on here beyond the pandemic, beyond US-China trade war in Hong Kong and Taiwan and geopolitical skirmishes. There's a lot going on domestically, specifically in Singapore, but throughout the region, around innovation, around digitization, automation. All these things are accelerating in the pandemic, actually. And I think a lot of investments are going toward this rat race to kind of beat your competitors on ESG and sustainability and the next solution to climate change, even more immediately on vaccines and other biopharma adventures in Singapore and beyond in the region. So I think this is still an extremely dynamic place to live and work. And I think, it should be high on the list for UVA community to explore, to see if you can make it out here and hopefully lead your life here for a few years.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I'll jump in just to thank Harry, Shirley, and Michelle for joining us today. This has been such a great conversation among all of us. I'm sorry we've run out of time. I just want to say that, it's been a little fashionable over the past couple of months here in the United States to say one of the lessons of this pandemic is that it means it's the end of globalization. All of us are going to retreat to our native lands and build walls and shut out all foreign influences. But that is not the conclusion I've reached at all because of all of this. In fact, I think the past few months have really underscored that there are growing and dangerous threats to all of the world, regardless of borders, and that really the only way that we're going to prevail in the face of them is by cooperating more and communicating more with our partners around the world. And so it's true, we're going to face a tough slog, I think, for the immediate future. People don't want to get on airplanes as easily as before. People are a little bit worried about studying abroad. But I am absolutely convinced that if we're going to remain relevant and successful as a university, we have to intensify our efforts to prepare our students to engage with the world, to study foreign languages, to travel, to enrich themselves with the perspective and experiences of other cultures and languages, and to conduct research across these national lines. So sure, it's going to be harder for the months ahead, but we're going to be developing other opportunities using new platforms like we've discovered and are perfecting over the past few months to promote more contact and engagement around the world. And we look forward to relying on our UVA community in the world to help us and support us. So we're very much looking forward to work with you. And thank you so much for your support for the university and your continued engagement. So with that, I'll say goodbye. And Maggie, thanks to you and your team for making all of this possible.
Thank you. And thank you all for attending. Thank you to all of our panelists for participating. Really great conversations. Just so everyone knows, this will be available on our uvaclubs.virginia.edu website. I will also be following up with a very brief couple question survey to get your thoughts. And please feel free to reach out anytime questions we didn't get to. I have written down and I will be sure to get a response for you. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.